often see coverage. You'll often see coverage saying, 50% of mass shooters had a mental disorder. The U.S. Secret Service that does these reports actually does not make a big deal of that. In their report, they say, well, in fact, these days, 50% of the population has a mental disorder. So it's statistically expected that 50% of mass shooters would as well, right? So they don't make any link between these two things, as they shouldn't, because there is no link between violence and mental disorders. In fact, there's probably even a link against that link, or evidence against the link. So what has happened in the meantime? Well, what's happened is mental health laws have broadened dramatically. So no longer are you just a danger to yourself or others. Is that the only criterion? And that is still a criterion. But that's interpreted very broadly, how we understand what it means to be in some way at risk of harming yourself. And now it's expanded to terms like at risk of mental or physical deterioration. Grave disability standard is that you might not be able to take care of your own needs. So it's an extremely paternalistic expansion of how we're understanding who we should be involuntarily committing. So that has expanded a lot. And as a result, what I found was that the rates of detentions have gone up dramatically. Unfortunately, there's a huge caveat here, and that is virtually no states are tracking really well how many people we're committing. So this is far out of the public dialogue. However, between my own research and a UCLA group did some, just by great coincidence, we're doing some of the same analysis at the same time as I was. So I got to access their studies, and we found that essentially the rates of involuntary commitment or detention, I have to say, because we have to separate out who's being forcibly treated from who's being detained. We don't really have numbers on treatment that well, but we do have numbers on who's being held. And those numbers show that it's been increasing dramatically for decades and doubling and tripling in that sense. And that now, currently, the rates are about 350 per 100,000. And in context, that's double, triple, even higher the per capita rates of detentions in most other Western countries with comparable standards of living and comparable mental health systems. So America and Canada together, interestingly, despite the differences in our healthcare systems, our rates of detentions are going up quite dramatically for decades now. Along with that, something I explore in the book is the science of this is enormously sparse. So it's ridiculously sparse. So there's been, when anyone went before me kind of looking for studies on, does involuntary commitment actually help people? Does forcibly detaining, does forcibly treating, do locked wards help? Do spontaneous emergency drugging, does that help? Does restraining people help? Do any of these components of it help? Or does the thing as a whole help? There's really no evidence of that in the scientific literature. It's even hard to find anybody who's even studied this as a phenomenon that way. And this isn't just critics. And in fact, most of the studies I found were done by people who were promoting forced treatment, and they were frantically trying to find evidence. And they were saying, whoa, this is really bad, folks. Like, we need some evidence. And, we're promoting this and we're saying it's good and we're saying it's helping, and we have no indication. And it's partly as a result of that, because of this lack of evidence, that now the World Health Organization and the United Nations have actually come out against forced treatment. We've seen that development as a result of the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, where they said this is really just arbitrary detention and even torture. They've defined it as under these laws, because there's really no evidence that it helps people, and we have an ever-growing pool of evidence of the harm it causes, people being traumatized by it, people suffering the repercussions of some of these drugs and other treatments, electroshock and so on and so forth. So we have no evidence scientifically to support this. Another real big problem, and again, we just got to call our governments on this, nobody's doing outcome tracking. That's more broadly across the whole mental health system, as near as I can tell, but absolutely around involuntary commitment. So nobody's really tracking what happens to people if we do lock them up. Do they get better? Do they get worse? What do they report experiencing a year from now? Are they back at work? Are they homeless still? Are they not homeless anymore? Did we make them homeless? What are the outcomes, the quality of life outcomes, the things we supposedly really care about? These are not being tracked at all. And that goes across the board. So this is a problem in mental health. And that's why one of the reasons I don't generally even promote, oh, we need more voluntary mental health services, because the reality is, in a lot of cases, we don't even have the evidence for those. So I just say, if anything, we should all be lobbying for this regularly, is better tracking of what works, what doesn't work, why does it work, who says it's worked, who is the one that's saying it's working throughout the whole system, but particularly if we're going to force it. I mean, if someone says it's working for me, okay, that's a valid point, that has some value that we should recognize and I think respect in all of this. But if they're absolutely saying this isn't helping me and I don't want it, then really we have to have a much more robust evidence base to be lobbying for it, and we don't have that at all right now. And in fact, we have the opposite. In this context, I want to highlight, and maybe we'll return to this during the discussion. So outpatient coercion is going up a lot, and this isn't being tracked at all. So I've already said, we have really poor data. Like, we found some data in about 25 states, and David and Cohen and I from USA more or less agree that there are about 5 states where we kind of went, that's pretty good data. So that's it. So a minuscule part of the country even has what we would call reasonably good data on how many people are being detained, and even those know nothing on outcomes, though. We don't know what's happened to them. So, and in that context, outpatient coercion is increasing dramatically. And by that, I mean, so we do have assisted outpatient treatment, these types of community treatment orders where people are actually forcibly drugged in their communities. But what I found a lot of evidence for is, say, the average group home is just a highly coercive environment, and that they seem to be routinely using involuntary detentions as a punishment tool, as a coercive control tool. So if in some way you're misbehaving by the standard of the group home, the person staffing it will just call 911 and get you locked up, get you tranquilized, and sent back to the group home again. And all this happens really fast. So just you don't even get a hearing usually. They're just, the threat itself makes you say, okay, I'll take my drugs again. If that was even it, right? It might not have been, it could have been anything else. I'm just saying there are this way in which it's used as a sort of controlling tool. And this seems to be one of the big drivers of the rising rates. And because what we're really seeing is in a lot of cases, these detentions are not very long at all. Like, by that, I mean, sometimes just days, even hours. And you're saying, what's going on? And it would seem that either, and I think both are happening, psychiatrists are disagreeing. So somebody in the community is going, they should be locked up. They're getting taken up there, and the psychiatrist going, I don't see the evidence, and they let the person go fairly quickly. That's happening. And also the psychiatrist going, look, you know the game here. We're going to detain you for a few weeks. We're going to forcibly drug you, and you're going to have a hellish experience. Or you can just take these drugs. We're going to up your dose, and you're going to go back to the group home tonight. Which do you want? And there's tons of people reporting those kinds of experiences happening. Unfortunately, it's not being tracked, so I can't really say that, with absolute confidence, but there's a lot of mounting evidence that this seems to be a trend in the culture. And so we really need to count those people when we say how much coercion is going on in our communities. Those people living in those kinds of circumstances need to be counted as well, because from then on, they may never end up in the psychiatric hospital at all, but they feel constantly under threat, under coercion. Maybe their income is going to be taken away. Maybe they're going to lose their housing. And there are studies that show that. For example, in California, they did a study of housing first. There's supposed to be housing first housing facilities. That is, they're not supposed to be coercing you. They're just supposed to provide housing no matter your condition, whether or not you're using recreational drugs or anything like that, and then just offer you assistance. But they found that 60% of them, at a minimum, were using threats all the time to coerce people into treatment and to stay on treatment. So even though they weren't supposed to under the law, this was widespread in California. So that's example. We do have some evidence to support what I'm saying beyond my own sort of interviewing of people. So, okay, I just want to show a few slides now. So I'll do a little screen share here to go through a few on a couple more topics I want to cover. All right. So that's working, I think. All right. So who is this really happening to? And this is one of the real things I cover extensively in the book. And it's just how it's happening to who it's happening, because there's this cliche out there, this caricatured image of it's a a psychotic, violent, homeless person. It often doesn't even sound real when you really kind of get to know people who are in these kinds of situations. The caricatured image that's in our news media around this and that legislators put out there. But it's not only those people. That's certainly one subgroup. But also I found throughout this, I just want to highlight at the top that we often see definite prejudices and cultural drivers, because really psychiatric diagnoses and the criteria for detention are quite subjective. So we'll see all sorts of prejudices seeping into how these decisions are made. 911 is one of the most common ways, people calling on each other, calling on homeless people, or on, people, sometimes their own family members, schools using this. And we'll kind of talk about these sort of different institutions. Often 911 is their preferred method of using it. Police are usually duty bound to show up. They'll often, they can make their own call, but in most cases, they do take the person to the psychiatric hospital. 988 is another big funnel into involuntary detentions. And I explore that at length in my book. And so this is often people who are actually help seeking. They want to talk to somebody, but instead they're getting subjected to an involuntary call, a trace of where their call is coming from, and an involuntary detention. Family and domestic conflicts are one of the most common, and I think we really need to start raising questions about that. When we see so many family members promoting forced treatment, we have to raise questions about, well, what's really going on in that family? Is it truly in the best interests of whoever it is they're trying to get forcibly treated? Is there abuse, a history of abuse in that family? Do we know? How do we know? Because I found lots of cases where that was it. When I looked into it at all, I found that it was very common for abusive families, abusive parents to use involuntary commitment laws against their children, against their adult children, in a very deliberate way. Child Protective Services often use them, intervening in family custody battles and so on, getting somebody diagnosed, using the involuntary commitment powers also against children. So schools and universities use them a lot, particularly schools. And we have studies of this. Again, I found lots of examples, but now we have actual robust evidence coming out, because Florida has been tracking how many children, rising rates of involuntary detentions of children, and where those are coming from, and how they drop dramatically in the summer months and go up during the school year. And we have evidence from multiple states that mainstream media have even covered of these of schools routinely using this as some sort of, either distressed or disruptive children in some way, getting them, calling 911, getting them taken up to a psychiatric hospital where things can just fly off the rails. Long-term care and nursing homes really like to use antipsychotics for behavior control. So, and again, we have high rates there, lots of studies showing that there's these extremely high rates, and it's worse in Canada, probably because of our public health care that's paying for it all. So that's one of the ways public health, universal health care can kind of backfire, is that there's no end to the involuntary treatment you can give people. The insurance company never steps in to say no. So the rates of that in nursing homes in Canada are almost double what they are in the United States. So it's really abusive. Streets and shelters, we know. Workplaces. So I found real coercion entering into workplace conflict resolution processes, where usually the higher level employee, the boss, is immune to kind of the conflict situation, and it's the person who's, the victim down the rung in the hierarchy who gets kind of pressured into interpreting their problem in the workplace as somehow a psychological problem and getting coerced into treatment, and then sometimes actually getting forced. banks, airports, tax authorities, government agencies. I found examples of all of these using these powers against complainants and protesters, often easier than getting them charged with an actual crime, just getting them charged with sort of being really disruptive, acting crazy, and so on. And then I did find lots of evidence. Again, this is the Department of Justice has been doing this. The Civil Rights Division and the Healthcare Fraud Division have lots of cases. They're actively investigating these all the time of large-scale fraud in this space. And this is the downside of the privatized healthcare in America, where there's a lot of money to be made by some of these institutions, and they are engaged in blatant using mental health law powers to fraudulently detain people. And of course, even nonprofits like to fill beds because they have a bottom line as well. And so that's what I've seen. So I just want to talk briefly about some of the improvements and alternatives. And this came up in some people's questions, so we can explore them more. But as I talked about earlier, the UN and the WHO the World Health Organization has issued some guides to state actors and around things that can be done in mental health systems to reduce or eliminate coercion altogether. And there are many examples, and some from America, but none of these are really getting funded. And I'll talk about that in a second. And other things, well, we need better outcome tracking, narrow the criteria for detention, strengthen oversight and accountability. That's just terrible around the country. Often government has a stake in keeping these places open. So even if they're really abusive, they don't close them down. There can be more class action lawsuits. The protection and advocacy organizations do this already. And then we can allow psychiatric advanced directives. We'll talk about that in the Q&A. And I'd like to emphasize this notion that we should separate policing from helping when we talk about this, because they're often getting bled together. Like if you want to advocate involuntary commitment as a policing tool, say that, and then let's have that public discussion. Do we think that's a good thing? What are your goals here if you're trying to police people? But if you're saying that it's helping, then separate these things two out. Often we're fluctuating back and forth. And I think with legislators that we got to separate that out as well. And then this is something David Cohen often raises, and that is we have to address each institution's true need. So why are all these institutions that I just talked about using mental health law powers? Each of them has a different reason why they find it helpful. And so we need to kind of get at those institutions, talk to them about it, and try to solve their problems a different way. For example, class sizes in school systems. Maybe classes are too large. It's hard for teachers to manage a classroom. If we can solve that problem, maybe they feel less prone to getting disruptive children detained. More housing first approaches. And I just highlight that this and many more we can talk about are not being implemented. Why is that the case? Because this is written into the law. Right now in mental health law across North America, psychiatrists, physicians are given absolute authority under the Act. They're the top of the hierarchy. Everyone else in the system, no matter their training as a practitioner, what type of practitioner they are subservient to the decisions of the psychiatrist. So in that sense, we have a medicalized law. And I say, one of the things we really got to look at figuring out how to do is to demedicalize that law. If we're going to keep involuntary commitment on the books in some way, if we're not going to ban it, and I think maybe there's a strong argument for a total ban and abolishing it, but if we aren't going to do that, then one of the things we can look at is at least say, what is this thing? And why should psychiatrists be in charge of it, of all people? Like, who should be in charge of it? Maybe it's a multidisciplinary team that makes these kinds of decisions. All right, that's that. Okay, so that's it. I got to take a breath. That's the end of my sort of formal talk. And we have some questions here. And I see I got through that pretty quick, I think. So we got lots of time left, so that's good. All right.
Oh, do you want me to start with the questions we had earlier?
Yeah, you bet. Oh, when I take a drink of water.
Okay. First of all, again, thank you for your solid research and honest reporting and taking on a topic that I'm pretty sure you probably get some hits on sometimes because this is not a popular stance that you take. So I want to appreciate that. So prior to this, we had people who responded to a questionnaire and asked some questions. So we're going to ask some of those, and we're also going to get to some of the chat comments and questions. So one of the, I'm not sure if this is a question or more, can you comment on, and you did some of this in your talk, but I don't know if you want to add to it, personal experiences, and then what happens for months or longer after the patient gets out, after the person gets out of the involuntary commitment. And
yeah. And there's probably people on this call during our chat who can add to this, so I won't say a lot, but the repercussions seem to be lifelong for many people, even people who, I've talked with, say, a fellow who was only locked up for 11 days. And he was treated relatively respectfully, I guess, if you could say that there was anything respectful about an involuntary commitment process, but he wasn't like more extensively abused because he was very polite and respectful the whole time he was there. But he, to this day, we're like 30 years on from that, and is to this day, it completely has changed his life, and then you add to that somebody who had, in his case, he had no real diagnosis of mental illness, no history of trauma in his life. He was a professional, accomplished, had all the privileges that you want to have in North American society today, all these things buttressing him, and it still devastated him, And so then when you add in all these other things that many people who are in the mental health system have had happen to them already from their childhood, from previous experiences, the heightened state they may be in when all this is happening, it can be an absolutely just brutal experience to go through, frightening, disorienting, traumatizing, and often lifelong. And it's just terrible that as a culture, people out there going, oh, we need more of this, really having no comprehension of that. And it makes me really sad that that isn't written about more whenever people are writing about it in the media, like I do not appreciate at all how it gets covered in the news media, although I as you know, I'll work in it.
Well, that's why we appreciate you, because you tell the real story. So then I'll do one more question from our prior questions and then maybe go to some chat. And this is an important one, really. Well, they're all important, but is systemic racism being documented in terms of overdiagnosis of paranoid schizophrenia, more frequent use of electroshock, over use of medication with multiple neuroleptics, and more difficulty being released from conservatorship? And conservatorship is another way of detention.
I like this question because it highlights, yeah, that would be logical things for us to know, wouldn't it? That would be logical stuff for us to track. Those are very reasonable questions. And no, we don't. Like, we have a little bit of evidence of that in voluntary care, usually, as in voluntary, I say, right? So we know that, yes, there's abundant evidence that if you're a Black person, you're multiple times more likely to get diagnosed with schizophrenia and being labeled as violent on top of that than a white person. And this gets tested, like they just give psychiatrists little anecdotes that are exactly the same, except at one point it says Black and at the other point it says Caucasian or doesn't say Black or whatever. And psychiatrists will, even in that context, this very idealized laboratory test context, more likely to diagnose the Black person with schizophrenia. And the relevance of that for this talk too is that if you're labeled with schizophrenia, that's one of the most common diagnoses that's going to get you involuntarily treated as well, right? A depression, a label of anxiety disorder, for example, you're far less likely to get involuntarily treated almost solely on that basis. Like schizophrenia kind of starts down a path of prejudice and control very quickly in this space. So, but unfortunately, yeah, we don't know how many people. The only state I know that's tracking involuntary uses of electroshock is Texas. And so they have some rudimentary data there, we see. Again, it's hard to even know, though, to separate that out from the non-involuntary ones, because people are often misled and lied to. And if you don't have informed consent, that's pretty much de facto coercion anyway. So that data is not entirely reliable, and that's the only one that at least put it on the books and that goes back some years where they actually started to require it across the state. So no, we don't really have good data with respect to involuntary commitment on any of this stuff, and we really should.
So I'm going to make a comment if I might. So I just read somewhere, I don't know if it was part of your writings, Rob, or someone else's, but one of the things that got pointed out that I totally remember is if you were doing a workup on somebody, you always started with Mr. Smith is an African American male, a Hispanic male, a female, Hispanic female, who and with and that would be great if we were putting it in a cultural context, but that's not the way it's presented. So I just want to add to that question.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, and I should correct that sometimes at a kind of more local level, a county level, we might get some data like this. Like I think it was Alameda County in California showed that, if you were Black in that county, you were I think it was 5 times more likely to get detained in a psychiatric hospital, even, relative to the population size. So we do get sometimes data like that emerging in certain counties, certain institutions, but we don't really have any good kind of state level or national level data in either Canada or the United States.
Susan Fitzmaurice, do you have some questions? I didn't want to jump over you.
Actually, one that hasn't been covered here and something I've been curious about is in Michigan recently we had the teenager that shot I can't remember what 4 students in high school, and his parents got prosecuted for allowing him to have a gun and not seeking mental health treatment. What do you think? What kind of effect do you think that's going to have on parents and schools and everybody forcing treatment on teenagers that might need other kinds of resources?
Yeah, it's scary, right? And really that is it's a furthering of something that we're already doing a lot. Like I think I can't recall if I actually include some cases like this in the book offhand, but I've definitely talked with lots of people who, oh yeah, there are some cases. Yeah, I do include some cases in the book, right? There was a prominent national one, right, of Peltier, right? I've forgotten her first name, the young woman who was locked up, taken away from her parents because her parents were trying to get her treatment for a physical condition. A psychiatrist at another hospital decided, no, I don't believe that. I think she's got a psychological condition. And it ended up being this tussle between the child and the parents on the one side and the institution on the other. And for about 1.5 years, the institution won and got the child taken away from the parents in order to forcibly treat her with psychiatric drugs. And she got so much worse because of her physical condition. The parents ultimately won her back. And and she got better after that, and they lost their lawsuit. That they finally, that was years ago, and the lawsuit was just like a couple of years ago now, and they lost that lawsuit. So yeah, we've seen this on the books really for a long time. It's embedded in our practice that parents are under enormous pressure to make sure that their kids are getting treatment as soon as those kids are within the scope of the mental health system. So yeah, I think I think it's frightening, really, right? Because now, even if you are a parent who really wants to try other methods and doesn't, you're comfortable with your child, even without an incident like this coming into play, right? You're under pressure constantly.
Yeah, 10 years. Both of them got 10 years in prison.
Yeah. I mean, it sounds like there's a lot of, a case like that. You have to look at the details, right, to see how that might then be used as precedent in other cases. And there were some other unusual things at play, like the way, the father had given him the gun and there, and the parents had asked him to take the child away that day. And there's all these things playing out. But yeah, either way, it's just concerning that the judge again has no critical perspective on, well, really, do we have evidence to support a mental health treatment per se, if in fact that's what they were recommending. It's unclear at that point too what they even mean by mental health treatment. In this case, the counselors, I think, were just saying take the child home today, and the parents refused, and that was part of what indicted them. Like the school was worried enough that they were saying, we don't feel safe with your child right now. So that's a, kind of a different sort of conflict.
Thank you. So I'm going to go back to some of our questions that were submitted previously. And this one's about psychiatric screenings for school children, and how that impacts, can kids get sucked into the psychiatric drug and psychiatric treatment merry-go-round?
Yeah. So we do, like, these screening tools, they're notorious for false positives. So, every study that's looked at them will find that, yeah, like 7 times as many kids who actually have depression will get labeled with depression. And, depression in itself is a very subjective diagnosis. So you've just taken something that's highly subjective and multiplied it by 7. And all these kids are now going to get exposed to, like, oh, maybe you have depression. We'll have to send you to the psychologist or the psychiatrist, and what comes out of that. And so what we're finding is that it's a funneling system. Yes, like more and more kids are getting exposed to mental health system, and within that, we're increasing the numbers who will ultimately get coerced and or get involuntarily treated. And wherever we have data, we see that this is the fastest rising group in involuntary detentions is children. And I have no doubt that it's a direct relationship to this, because we have schools that are training the teachers, training the administrators, training the children themselves. Check yourself into the emergency room. We see kids voluntarily going to emergency rooms themselves at the slightest sign of distress. If you look at these training programs, I often say things quite simply like, if you're sad for more than 2 weeks, you may have a biochemical imbalance and you need professional help. Like, it'll say things like that in these training programs. So it's very explicitly coercive that way, and very deceptive, because, what I just said, there's no evidence to support that. And yet it's what we're teaching children. And so it's understandable that children are embracing these diagnoses now, embracing the system, checking themselves in, and whether they do it voluntarily or involuntarily, they're often getting, there's a certain percentage increasing will be involuntarily treated along the way.
So I saw a hand raised, which has come down, and now I see in the chat, Eddie, you wanted us, did you have a specific one of the pre-submitted questions I haven't asked yet?
Well, I mean, I had submitted questions, so I just thought it would be good to address those, to give those priority. That's all.
Oh, I appreciate that. So I'm alternating as best I can.
Okay.
I asked, did you have a specific one?
Thank you.
Did you have a specific?
Oh, I was asking about, I think mine was about advanced directives, psychiatric advanced directives, and
Yeah, so that's a
See
great
those.
question. I'm a big fan of the idea of psychiatric advanced directives, because then there are some people who say, hey, I know that I can go a bit crazy, and I want, to be reminded, and here's my, the drug that I find does help me, and these other ones I don't like. And so I like that it could help both sides of this a little bit. The people who actually do sort of want some kind of intervention could maybe guide it a little bit and say, here's somebody I trust to help me in this kind of situation. Here are the things that I found helpful. And other people who say they haven't found it helpful could say that. And in principle, there are some states that have said, yes, this is the law of the land in this state. There's a national registry. If you look it up, there's like not a national registry. Sorry, there's a clearinghouse. It's like a place where you can find out the status of the law in your state. So it's a national thing in the United States. So yeah, there is unfortunately no national registry. I'll correct that. And there aren't even state registries. I don't think any. If they are, they're very rudimentary. And this is one of the problems. So the studies I found that people that are tracking it, the people that set up this site, they're people that have done some formal studies of it as well. This sort of site that has sort of state by state breakdown of what are the laws in your state and where are the links to that. And what they're finding is that, well, health institutions don't want to follow them. Doctors don't want to follow them. Most patients don't know about them. And pretty well everywhere I've seen, literally everywhere I've seen, there's always an out clause. So for involuntary commitment. So these things are almost ironclad for any other kind of healthcare treatment, but not for psychiatric care and involuntary treatment for psychiatric care. And there's always an out clause. And so, yeah, that's a problem, as you can see, because that's the whole point why we'd want them in a way is to have them. And there are some hurdles there. I don't want to say, it would be mindlessly simple to implement something like this, because there are questions around, well, what if you ask for something that isn't even available, right? And things like that. So there are some hurdles that would have to be worked out, but unfortunately, there's a lot of inertia within the system where the doctors just don't really want you telling them, right, what they can do or should do. And so they've been demonstrably resistant, and even where it is law, they're finding their ways around it. And then of course guardianships can kick in and bypass these things altogether. So yeah, like I think it'd be great. I think it's worth lobbying around them to strengthen them further and to utilize them. I think everyone should have one regardless, because you can throw it down, and if you have the money or have support, you could challenge it, maybe go to the Supreme Court, see if you can do a test case with the Psychiatric Advance Directive. So I encourage everyone to have them, because judges will also take them a bit seriously. They'll look at them. Like, again, they won't necessarily abide by them, but if it's a good judge, a responsible judge, he might, consider it and go, okay, well, this is what they wanted. Let's factor that in here, right? So I've seen that playing out, so enduring powers of attorney, advance directive, substitute decision maker, any documentation that's relevant in your state, I think is worth doing if you have some ideas about what kind of treatment you would want.
Yeah, I'm looking to move to another state, and I was wondering.
Yeah, is there one?
would be
Well, you
better
can
than
go to
others.
that website and see where they're
Yeah, Jim put
Yeah.
a link up there. Thanks, Jim.
Yeah,
Yeah.
let's point to that first. People who didn't see it, Jim Godstein put a link to the advance directives, finding out about them in each state. It's in the chat. So thank you for pointing that out.
Great. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. And that's it. But, like I say, there's always an out. I haven't seen a state yet that doesn't have an
Well,
out.
what I was encountering was that I would show up, I have a history with psychiatry of psychiatric hospitalizations, but I started showing up to the ER for other things like chest pain, and
Yeah.
they're threatening to send me to the nut ward.
Yeah,
And-
yeah, and that's a whole other issue. That was a good question too. Like, what do you do? How can you protect yourself showing up to a hospital if you've got some other issue and they're going to end up psychiatrizing you instead, not taking it seriously? And we have lots of evidence that that happens a lot. And I just say one of the best is just going with someone else, someone who knows you, someone who can verify. Yeah, no, this person, I know them. Like, this is an unusual situation, and I believe it's physical. So that's just extra backup. And they know if they psychiatrize you in the moment, there's someone with no psychiatric history there who's kind of like supporting you. So there's things like that you can kind of do that I think are just, going to up your odds of having a better outcome.
Okay.
So I
Thank
see
you.
a couple of hands, but
And-
before we do that, we also had several questions on electroshock. I'm gonna,
Can I comment a little bit about a suggestion on advanced directives? One of my, I suggest when people do a psychiatric advanced directive, that whether it's on the form or not, that they get someone to basically say that you were competent at the time you signed it. Because one of the ways that they go around it is to say, oh, you were incompetent when you signed it, and therefore you can't do it. And the higher ranking letters after the person's name, the better. So anyway, that's just a practical thing that I thought I would mention.
Great. Thank you, Jim. Yeah, absolutely.
so I'm gonna ask a couple of these ECT questions that we got in advance. and
Yeah,
then-
maybe we can get through them fast to say, no, there's no data tracking. I talked a little bit about that earlier, around it. So what were the other questions there?
Well, one of the questions that I'm also personally interested in is there research done on memory, cognitive
Oh,
function
yeah.
during and after ECT? I mean, people don't have, this speaks to informed consent. If it's there,
Yeah, exactly. And, you know, interestingly, there are some jurisdictions that have a more robust requirement for trying to create a level of informed consent. I think it was Texas, maybe, that passed some law. So, you know, you can actually see the wording where it mentions the possibility of longer term memory loss. I think that was the sort of thing they ended up fighting about, tussling around. But unfortunately, yeah, there's very little. Somebody did a study of this recently too. I think all across the UK. We've seen it elsewhere where people are routinely misled around the adverse effects of electroconvulsive therapy. My dad had it. I witnessed these adverse effects. They're terrible. I also witnessed how much they lied to us and misled us about all of that stuff. And yeah, it's really unfortunate. And no, it'd be so simple, right? To just institute routine testing of memory, for example, cognitive capacity before, during, and after, and we'd have some decent evidence to work with. And you know, I know why they don't do it. They don't do it because every time we've looked at it at all, you see consistently, yeah, a lot of people suffer pretty severe impacts, and it just doesn't look good on electroconvulsive therapy. So the people who implement it don't want to do that kind of tracking. Like, I just think it's fairly clear, and that states, you know, governments have to be pressured to do it, to require it, you know, in a more objective and neutral way.
So just an interjection here. I witnessed on more than one occasion in a job that I had where they would get someone to sign on, or the family would sign on for the shock, and then immediately coming out of it, they'd ask the person to voluntarily sign the form while they were still out of it.
Yeah, you know, totally. Yeah, it's
Form. That's an abuse for sure. And
yeah.
I've seen it. So, okay, so then I just want to make sure we're getting the questions. And I know that Scott had a hand raised. Before that we do that, let's do one more question. And then Scott, let's go from that were pre-submitted. And then Scott, and we need to do a draw before we get off. And then we'll go to Scott, who had a hand raised. So one of the questions was, do you think the crisis of doctor suicides will lead to any systemic changes in how the mental health system operates?
No, I don't. You know, all I wanted to say around that is I have examples like this in my book. But what we find is, like, psychiatrists and medical doctors are just as likely to get involuntarily committed in all sorts of situations as anyone else. So that's my answer to the question. Yeah, we don't see that. Like, basically what I'm showing evidence of there is you know, and there's some Harvard psychiatrists I interview, particularly around the coercive systems in their workplaces around this. And what you find is, okay, so yeah, you're a Harvard psychiatrist and you routinely have the power to commit others. The moment you kind of step out of line in a certain way, you yourself can be just labeled, pathologized, and taken completely not seriously, just like the average quote unquote psychotic homeless person is treated, you know, in this kind of context. Like, that's the power of psychiatric labeling. It is so prejudicial, and it's amazing how quickly you can go from an esteemed, reputable member of society, quote unquote, to, you know, certified mental patient, you know, being treated against your will. As I talk about in my own case with my father, right, who was a career college professor of computer engineering with no history of psychiatric illness, and literally overnight, you can go from that to certified mental patient being treated against his will. Like, it's incredible how quickly and absolutely powerful these labels really are in this space, you know?
And I think we had, Scott, did you have something you wanted to say or ask?
Well, no, actually, I think you should get to the the questions that were sent in.
Okay, I appreciate that. We're trying to go through them. There's a lot of them. Y'all did a great job on this. Did you have one in particular you wanted us to respond to that I missed so far? Okay, so some of the questions are,
Yeah, we've covered some of them, looking at them too.
Yeah, well, some of the questions about change. So here's one.
Yeah, maybe let's get to that. Just there's one before that I want to answer is that somebody
Oh.
asked about expunging a psychiatric evaluation on a mental health record. Very, very, very hard. I've heard of it. The only time I've heard of it happening, so somebody basically worked with another psychiatrist and psychologist for years, withdrew from all the psychiatric medications in collaboration with them, went years more so that they witnessed all this. And they ultimately said, we believe the diagnosis was incorrect from the beginning. And they basically wiped that from the record in that way, even though the record's still there, but they officially said, we believe the diagnosis was never correct. That's the only kind of situation I've ever really heard it happening. You can't just I've never heard of anyone suing and managing to get mental health diagnosis removed from a record, and that's important because of the potential lifelong consequences of this. And it's an area I think that I guess lawyers could start working at now that we're seeing some of these repercussions. And I guess I should qualify that there's certain areas where sometimes you can get it suppressed, if not, thrown out. So we've managed to do that at the border now, so that there seemed to be less draconian between the US-Canada border. For a while, they were stopping people who had any kind of police mental health history, like that a police intervention had happened. If that was on their record, and they would find that record at the border, and were preventing people from crossing the border. But there was some analysis of this, and it seems like they've stopped doing it, as far as I know.
I hadn't heard that, but I've heard about that. Also, domestic violence. If you had like a call without a conviction, just the call and it's on your record, you couldn't cross. So,
Right.
No.
Oh, please. Yeah, go ahead.
Go on.
Oh, I was just laughing. Read that second question in the change list. I like that one.
Can you help?
Right. Somebody asked, can you help? And I say no. Sorry, no, I can't. I do routinely, if you reach out, right, I try to suggest things just like we're doing tonight. I just go, well, have you tried this? Have you tried that? And based on people I've interviewed, people's experiences, experts I've interviewed, things like that. But no, the reality is like these laws are so powerful. It's so hard to fight your way out. And there are a million things you can try, and some of them work for people, and that's great. But if you're failing winning that battle, don't criticize yourself, because these are really hard laws to fight when you're fighting, and there's a lot of strategies that I talk about in the book that, we can't go on about them forever, but yeah, I can't really, unfortunately, help at that beyond that.
So then, the question that I think relates to that is, do you have hope that things will change? If so, what gives you that hope?
Yeah, I got to admit, I've been thinking about this question for a while now, and people ask it, and there's a way to put that back, because I think for each of us, despair comes up in a different way, and for each of us, we have to ask, well, what is the thing that most provokes my despair? And then that's the thing we can address. But speaking just for myself, like I find for me, hope is mostly actually really small stuff, right? So I'm hopeful, like in my daily life, it's just that. It's like, oh, I hope that I'm going to have a roof over my head tomorrow. I hope that I'm still going to be, as functional so that I can kind of take care of myself and things like that. These are the things that kind of I'm oriented around. Like, yeah, I'm feeling good. I feel hopeful. I'm strong. I've got energy, and that's the reality. That's one of the things that keeps me hopeful. It's just focusing on those things that I can kind of control a little bit and influence, and that are positives in my own life. More broadly around these issues, no, I do not have any hope. I have no hope. No hope operating around these issues we're discussing. It's clear our society is going in the other direction, en masse, with incredible force, incredible funding behind it. All these issues I'm looking at are getting worse by the day. So I have no hope in that space. But I just think I don't preoccupy myself with that. I just preoccupy myself then with like, okay, what do I want to do? Where can I maybe influence some change? I derive a lot from these kinds of discussions, honestly, connecting with people, meeting other people who are working in these spaces and trying to support each other, from having those personal connections with people who say, hey, thank you for the work you did, and I can thank them for the work they're doing. Like, those things are huge, because that's all we really have right now. Like, we don't have a movement. We really don't, right? We've got a sort of collection of us who, and some organizations working in the space, and more people caring about this, and a little more attention than we had. So I'm a little hopeful about that. The intersections that someone else was writing about in their questions, I think the connections between the anti-carceral movement that's arising in our society, the disability rights movements that are happening, and the intersection of those with mental health disability rights, I think those are great and promising. So I derive some degree of hope from those. Hey, you know, maybe we can have more cross-sectoral collaboration about people who are dealing with other types of oppressions, and that they're now starting to understand psychiatric oppression like they didn't 20 years ago. I find. So yeah, I'm a little bit hopeful around that kind of stuff, but overall, yeah, I'm very pragmatic about it, and just say, okay, what am I working on? Like, I'd like to see more data tracking. I know that's not going to heal anyone tomorrow, but I do believe it could make a positive contribution to public understanding of this issue, and that's it, you know.
So I see a hand raised, Eddie, and we still have a few more questions.
I'm sorry, I just had to piggyback off of what Rob was saying about we don't have a movement. I, as a proud member of Generation X, have a lot of concerns about the way people who have grown up looking at screens and interacting less face to face are not able to organize, are not able to coordinate and communicate at an intimate human level to get things done. I think it's a huge problem. And anyway, I just couldn't leave that alone. Thanks.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. I think we've lost a form of activism. I remember, you know, local level activism groups. I think we need more of that. I mean, this is amazing that we can do this. I love it, but at the same time, yeah, I think it's contributed to fragmented social movements, and it'd be great to get some of that back.
And personality-based activism.
So I'm thinking maybe should we segue, like really invite people to ask questions now live? I mean, we've got a few more we can pull from.
I think we should, when are we going to do the draw though?
Yeah, we'll do the draw. I'm just thinking that, and maybe I'm just putting it out that we invite, and I'm going to do the draw right now while we're chatting, and invite people,
Perfect.
anyone who has questions now that they want to ask. And maybe it's one you submitted that we didn't get to, and you can just bring it back up. But yeah, I'm looking at the time and thinking, hey, we should, you know, I'd love to hear from other people too, their reactions to some of what they've heard from me. So I'll hold the draw while people are thinking about questions to ask. So,
Great.
okay.
And before we do that, I just want to say, I so appreciate everybody's questions. We just can't get to them all, but we're doing our best here. So I see a hand. Isaiah, you have a question?
Oh yeah, I wanted to tell Rob a little anecdote. I was listening to the torture section of his book on Audible, and I just happened to, without like even thinking about it, I drove past the concentration camp for disabled people that I was held in when I was listening to that section of your book, and I started to cry because I was thinking. I was at the part where the person you were interviewing said, if you detain a disabled person, even for 10 minutes, you're a torturer. And I remember thinking, because nothing really bad happened to me when I was put on an involuntary hold. I mean, I was just put on this hold for like a few hours and let go. And we're thinking, why was this like the most traumatic, horrible thing ever that like ever happened to me? And that really clicked with me when you got to that part of the book, like, oh yeah, because it's torture, And that part of the book really made me feel like really validated, and I really liked that part of the book.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, yeah, for saying that. And yeah, and I'm sorry you had to go through that. yeah, and that was Tina Minkowitz who said that. Yeah, I thought that was amazing. And she's a survivor herself, as well as an amazing lawyer and somebody who really, was so important in the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities in that process. She was submitting and doing all sorts of great legal analysis. So yeah, an amazing person. And thank you for sharing that.
And we have David has a hand up.
So I'm going to do the draw right now. I'm not looking. I'm going to randomize once, twice. I'm going to do 5 times, 3 times, 4 times, 5 times. And to the top person, it is Patty Jo Severson wins a hardcover book. Is Patty Jo here? Speak up, Patty Jo, if you're here. Because you can't win if you're not here. No Patty Jo?
Right, Rob.
Okay, I'm going to go to number 2.
Probably should be, you have to be here to get it.
Yep, you have to be here to get it. We said that in our.
Yep.
So the second one was Bonnie Jean Smith. Bonnie here? Speak up, Bonnie. Wow, why did they submit questions and not even show?
Maybe they had to get off. I'm not, sometimes.
Okay, the next one is Linda Wright. Linda, I see you there.
Hi.
Ooh, congratulations. You've won a hardcover book. So just
right.
email us your address and I'll send it out to you.
Okay, thank you.
All right. Okay, next question, and then I'll get to the audiobook.
Yeah, go on. We did David already, right?
David didn't get a chance
No,
yet.
Not
David.
yet.
No.
If
David.
I,
Then yell.
yeah, I'm gonna selfishly, I know this won't catch you off guard because I submitted it in advance, but I'm gonna selfishly ask because it hasn't been asked yet. 2 quick questions, and feel free to keep your answers super condensed too if you want, because of time. One of them is a kind of philosophical question. You mentioned, but also an activist political question. You mentioned the possibility of abolition of forced treatment or involuntary treatment. Do you see that connected to the movement for abolition of psychiatry? I'm encouraged to move this question up to the front because of the chat. There were a lot of people talking about the arbitrary nature of psychiatric diagnoses and treatments and the ineffectiveness of treatment. And I have become a abolitionist in favor of abolishing all psychiatry in the last year. And I'm just wondering if you would see your work as supporting that broader movement, not just of involuntary treatment, but of abolition of psychiatry. The other question is a very specific one about if you're aware of any good alternatives. I'm not, to the 988 line, which is supposed to be an alternative to 911, but according to their rules is actually a carceral. It leads to a lot of involuntary, as you've written about in Med in America. Thank you so much for your work. I really appreciate it a lot, but just throw those out. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for the questions. You may need to remind me of the first one after I answered. So the second one, yeah, it's funny. I've been going through this recently. So we don't really know. Mad in America actually hired a couple people to try to find what crisis lines in America do not ever trace calls. And we know a handful, Samaritans, New York City, Wildflower Alliance. There are a few crisis lines that never trace calls are out there, but we don't know. Most of them aren't getting back to us. I recently discovered that my speculation, based on one of my sources, his speculation turned out to be correct. So we know now from a study from the National Association of State Mental Health Program Directors that there are 300 to 400 other lines, crisis lines, outside of the 988 system right now. So there are that many lines. So more crisis lines are outside 988 than inside it right now. And so what would be amazing is to actually find them all and bring them together and see what their policies are around all this, right? And maybe create a lobby to fund them in the same way 988's getting funding. But right now they're very disparate, hard to track them. So that's the answer to that question as best as I can give it, unfortunately. And what was your first question again? Just quickly, it was the
Activism philosophical question about.
Oh, right. Yeah. So
abolition of psychiatry.
Yeah. This is a problem area for me. So, I mean, I get what you're saying, obviously, and I critique psychiatry throughout my book. But what we're dealing with right now is, 20% of the population is taking a psychiatric drug at any one time, right? Something like 50% have visited a mental health professional or had some sort of mental health consultation. So the numbers just started getting astronomical. So it's kind of like being against, cats and dogs. Right? To say I'm against anyone having a pet, right? Like when you got half the population doing something, it's not a wise strategy to start saying that's, absolutely wrong and should be 100% abolished tomorrow. You can do it. And I think the message should be out there. And if you're one of the people who wants to voice that, I'm not going to be the one criticizing you, but I don't think it's realistic to kind of get a movement going that's going to be very successful that way in this kind of space when we're already being pathologized and downgraded on all these other aspects of our movement already, right? Or our collection of people that are trying to be a movement. So yeah, I just that's all. It just doesn't seem to me to be particularly realistic to try to take that avenue. I think those critiques need to exist, absolutely, and they're helpful and they're important, but I don't think, tying them together is going to advance the agenda. I guess that's what I'm just trying to say. Like, I don't think, oh yeah, we're going to abolish involuntary commitment faster if we tie it to the abolishment of psychiatry. No, I think probably even less likely to happen then, because I think psychiatry is far less likely to get abolished in the next 100 years at the rate we're going than involuntary commitment. And involuntary commitment itself is going in the other direction, right? We're seeing rising rates. We're seeing a greater embracing of this from legislators and on all sides, from politicians, from the general public in a way that we haven't seen for a while, that they're like, oh, this is great, So that's what we're up against right now. So I don't even know that, the abolition campaign, I mean, I support it, I do, and I'll say that, but at the same time, I'm working on other stuff that I think is a little bit more likely to happen in the near future, which is I think we could get a lot of pressure on governments to track outcomes, to track data, and that itself will be a savage indictment of the system and will work in both of these places. So I think we're more likely to win that battle in the near future. So that's kind of one of the ones I'm working on, but everybody has to, I think we need multiple voices in any kind of movement, right? Every revolution is created with multiple voices, and multiple approaches. And so I celebrate let's have a big umbrella, as big an umbrella as possible, and many people coming from different angles on this,
So I want to point to one comment. We got a hand raised and then a question in the chat. The comment I just have to point to because it made me smile. Me to the outside world, psychiatry is real. I just want to outlaw forced treatment. Me with the homies, abolish psychiatry. And then I know Yale, I hope I'm saying it right, Yale.
Yeah, very
Yale.
good. Hi, thank you so much, Rob, for this wonderful, wonderful presentation. Thank you for this very good clarification about what's realistic and what's not. I'm totally with you. I have a practical question that's sort of also not very practical. Like, I'm a survivor, and right now I'm doing psychiatric chaplaincy in an inner city hospital. So I have a question about advanced directives, like this advanced by psychiatric directives. I understand it varies by state, but let's say in New Jersey, right? It seems like they're very legal. They are sort of very legit. I don't know how to say it, right? So basically, is it a way around commitment? Like, people in my hospital have no idea they exist. They don't even, most of them speak English enough to understand what it says. They might not be legal, whatever. But in general, like, is it a way around commitment issue? if
Yeah,
somebody
I-
goes that route.
Yeah, I guess maybe you weren't here. I talked about that some earlier. I'll just kind of quickly summarize that. It's helpful, it can be helpful to have one of those. I encourage people to have them. And some states, as you say, are it's more robust, the law around it, than others. But no, there's always a loophole for psychiatrists, with involuntary commitment. They can always use it. As Jim Gottstein, attorney, also said when we were talking about it, that one of the ways they say is, well, you weren't really competent at the time you filled it out. They
Right,
try to
I've heard
get
that
you.
conversation, but let's say I took care of that. Let's say tomorrow I did all this legal paperwork. It doesn't mean that I cannot be shocked again, right?
It doesn't really mean that. No, there's always, I've never seen a state, and often it's written right into the law. I haven't looked at New Jersey, but you can probably find it where it'll say, in circumstances where, involuntary commitment, this, can be overridden, there'll be some language around that somewhere.
Right, so basically it's not really illegal.
It's not ironclad. I don't know of any ironclad approach. That's why, those of us who don't like involuntary commitment are kind of saying we need abolition, because
Right.
no matter how many.
Because there is always way around. I get it. Thank you
Yeah.
so much.
Jim's
That's
got
very
his hand up
helpful.
there.
I've never seen it enforced myself. And I mean, in a real kind of a way. Jim, I know you have your hand up, but I want to go to a question we had in the chat a while back. And then Jim,
And
what
I want to do the draw for the audiobook too, so before people start leaving. So
you want to draw while I
okay,
ask
I'll do that right
question?
now because I have it number here. So I'm closing my eyes again.
I see you peeking. I better win.
Okay, I've got Roger Scott Ladwig. Are you here, Roger, still? No, Roger? Okay, well, Eddie Zuber.
Yay. And that's good that I got the audiobook. So
Yay.
All right.
And then question in the chat, and then Jim had his hand raised. So one of the questions, which I think is really, as a trainer, and I myself am a trainer, and this person said I'm a trainer and teacher. What would you say to new clinicians, training clinicians, about this topic? I think I kind of lost the question, but what's your message to new training clinicians? Because at this point, I have to agree with this question. We have to help shape the people before they get inculcated in the lie.
Yeah. I mean, yeah. And here's what I have to say about that. Like, it'd be great to do that. What I learned during the course of researching my book, which I did not realize before, kind of makes sense, but you can't become a psychiatrist without involuntarily treating people extensively. It's like military training. It's like you have to learn to shoot a gun and shoot at targets and learn to kill on command. In psychiatric training, you can't graduate unless you have gone through numbers of rotations where you're involuntarily treating people, and not only by your own standard. It has to be the standard of your supervisor. So you're inculcated in what your supervisor believes is a situation that requires involuntary treatment. You have to do it, or else you could fail that rotation if you're not doing it consistently. So this is, it changes people. It changes them dramatically. And people said that to me. Said, Rob, when you're interviewing practitioners, you have to understand that, all of us have done this. We've done it. And so that has affected us and our thinking about it and how we talk about it. And that's why I say kind of the least reliable sources talking about involuntary commitment are really psychiatrists. Like, in some ways, we should never rely on them when they're talking about this publicly, because they've done it. Nobody could be more biased than that, right? We need people from outside the system making assessments about involuntary commitment and if it works or doesn't work and how it's working, what it's doing, what are the impacts it's having. It amazes me that psychiatrists don't get that. Like, it's incredible to me that psychiatrists often say, well, you're biased about involuntary commitment. And I go, who could be more biased than you? You're implementing this. And then they just stop talking to me.
Thank you. Good answer. Jim, you had a hand, I think, up.
Well, you kind of moved past it, but
Go on.
in terms of the advance directives and commitment, every state that I'm aware of, the commitment laws trump the advance directive, that they the idea is, well, there's a finding that you're a danger to self or others. So that's not really about, your decision making. It's about, it's about something else. I think the advanced directives are potentially most useful with about forced drugging. So anyway, that's just my.
Yeah, thank you, Jim. Yeah, and that's what I've seen too. I've never seen a state where it wasn't. And in fact, actually, I'm reminded now, I think it was SAMHSA did a study of that and that I found recently. They specifically looked at that question and they said that. They reviewed every state and went, no, there's nowhere that this is not being trumped.
And I want to add to this, SAMHSA just put out a huge RFP to pay for what they call assisted outpatient treatment. And then in their first paragraph, they actually say, also known as forced treatment for involuntary commitment. And so our government, who we pay taxes to, is funding this in a big way.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
one thing we haven't
Excuse me,
talked
could you
about
repeat that, please? Could you repeat that, what you just said, please?
If you go to the SAMHSA website, there's an RFP out to go to states and local governments to fund assisted outpatient treatment, which we all know means involuntary commitment, but I didn't actually think they would say that in the RFP. And in the first paragraph of the RFP, they say, this is to fund assisted outpatient treatment, also known as involuntary commitment.
Yeah, good for them for at least being honest about it. Because yeah. By the way, I just want to highlight that it just came up today that you can get 70% off the audiobook for my book right now. I don't control that. So I put the link there. If you just click on the link, you go to the 70%, or email me later if you want it. So that's quite a bit. It's down to like $7 for the audiobook right now.
So I highly recommend the book. We also have another author here, Jim Gottstein. Who else am I missing that's written some really important work related to this? And every time you write something about this, I know you become.
And I want to highlight what I like about Jim's book. One of the things I like about it, people are interested in this issue because it does revolve around involuntary commitment. And of course, he has all the stuff about the Zyprexa papers in his book, the Zyprexa papers, which is fascinating. And I was one of the people, Jim, I don't know if you know, that I actually had it posted on my website, distributing it because I was safe in Canada from prosecution there for a long time. But one of the things I really like about it is he follows a case of a patient client that he's working with a lot, who's just constantly, getting committed, and just, it's just a great example of like how, like, yes, the guy's struggling, he has troubles and that, but a lot of times it's just like, because he's annoying other people, and because they say things like, well, he's in danger because other people are going to beat him up. Like that's, right. And it's these kinds of things, and that's what I found too. Like it's actually, you're reading the case and you might think this is ridiculous, and it's extreme and it's unusual, and yet it's not. And I really found that like a really, engaging part of Jim's book.
And I just want to say, I believe that most families who go for a commitment are really struggling and don't know what to do, and their family member is totally annoying. And I think that most people get locked up for being annoying and unmanageable, and we can't stand them around us. And there's something wrong with that. I don't know why I haven't been locked up this week.
Yeah. Yeah.
In response,
I was just going to say, I think family members are a really important part of this politically and practically, and that we need to grapple with that more as a society. Like what's really going on there in families, and what might really help them. Because yes, like lots of people who I liked and trusted, and you know, told me like, hey, Rob, this is really hard, you know, this is really hard what I'm going through as a result of the distress of my child and stuff. And, you know, and they would describe it. And I go, yeah, that does sound hard. So like, what would really help them? You know, they didn't want to use involuntary commitment. In fact, they saw the impacts and they were shifting against it, but they still needed help. They would have benefited from help, you know, and what is the nature of that help? And I think as a society, we could talk about that a lot more. Sorry,
Thank you.
Emily. Yeah, Emily was going to say, I interrupted her.
Oh, thank you. Yes, in response to what Susan said earlier about, you know, family dynamics and stuff, when people feel like other people are irritating and getting on their nerves, it's just like, I feel like family members basically just don't know how to set healthy boundaries with each other. And they just don't know how to do conflict resolution. And so like when I was in my 5150 that was caused by 988, like I was trying to be open-minded, like, let's see if this actually helps me or not. But then I'm like, what the fuck? Like, I was put in a psychiatric detention caused by 988. And then at the end of my 5150, inside the psychiatric ward, when I heard this young man, like he said, the psychiatrist said that I can leave, but my mom doesn't want to pick me up. And so then I learned, so 5150s are basically expensive adult babysitting service by TV. It's like, I'm like, this is ridiculous. Just because parents or, you know, family members don't want you anywhere near their home because they find you like irritating, like that's, so I just thought that was really sad. And
yeah. Thank you, Emily. That's an amazing example because that's what I thought. It amazes me actually. You know, I'll see this in the medical records often when I'm reviewing people's records, like how often these doctors and medical staff just trust whoever the person is reporting someone else. It's like if I go in there and say, oh, you know, my friend is crazy, my child is crazy, my dad is crazy, it just seems like, oh, they immediately, you know, treat me as like, yeah, consummate, reliable source. And the other person is probably crazy and they start investigating them. It's very rare that, except that if I start saying, no, he's not crazy, I don't think you should treat him against his will. And then suddenly I'll get pathologized, you know, like I see this a lot in the medical, and it just amazes me the lack of sort of critique that they're you know, taking into these kinds of situations.
And I just want to add that I didn't mean to minimize them by say they're just annoying. I remember one Christmas, my mother playing this whole big old Christmas, and my cousin came, and my mother saw it as like, why is she ruining my Christmas? And, you know, which I got my mother's point of view. It's like, why could she not hold herself till after Christmas? On the other hand, myself and my other cousin kind of sat down and chatted with her. But I understood my mother's distress. It's like, she's ruining my event. And so I get where they get that, but it's really not, they didn't lock her up, but I'm just saying that's where they get frustrated. They don't know what to do. And we don't have enough assistance to the families to help them get through it. Like they need their own hotline and who can help, that doesn't say, yeah, the only thing you can do is lock them up. And that's kind of the advice they get. So anyway, I know Carolyn has her hand up.
Here.
Muted.
Okay. Yes, I had to unmute myself. Okay, sorry about that. So I was curious because I don't know if people are aware of this, but we have 32 different acronyms to cover voluntary, involuntary commitment, civil commitment. And so you have one state that's saying one thing, we're calling it one thing. We have 50 states in our nation. And so we have 32 different references of how we refer to civil commitment, detention, and involuntary commitment. So how do we come up with, and how do we effectively change so we don't have all these inconsistencies? Because these are a robbing, if you will, and a deprivation of your constitutional rights. And so those are federal things. That's not really a state right. I get that states have rights, but these are infringing on your constitutional rights. So we should at least be on the same page. If I have a driver's license in Arizona, I can still drive in California, I can drive in Montana, I can drive in Florida, I can drive anywhere in our country because I have a driver's license. So how do we get, so that means you have to take a test and you have to be, you have to have a license. So how do we get our civil commitment, detention, involuntary commitment? And I don't like to call it civil commitment because it's very uncivilized. How do we get to be on the same playing field? How do we do that? What's the, or we can have one acronym and we just call it the same. We call it that we refer to it as the same thing instead of the AOT or the IOT or the ITA, or we can go down and make a rap song out of this.
Yeah.
Right. So how do we correctively, make this kind of thing so we're synchronized in our terminology? Because California has gravely disabled as something that's very extensive versus maybe Washington State was 5, 6, 10, 15 years ago, because they've grown. Instead of becoming more narrow, they have become more broad in how they've given themselves rights to just lock you up and do whatever they want to.
Yeah. So I have a few thoughts on that. I mean, I think you should do a rap song about it. That's a great idea.
Oh, okay, I'll try it.
But yeah, and Jim sounds like he has his hand up. He may have a comment on this, but I just want to say, first of all, I do think federal guidance, we have the U.S. Supreme Court, and they did create what the standard was supposed to be, and it's been largely ignored by the states, right? So theoretically, somebody could try to, take a case up again and challenge that. Jim would probably know more about that kind of a process to me, but he's won some cases at the Alaska Supreme Court that then, got whittled down and changed again, and sort of there's this evasiveness in the system, and there isn't a level of sort of state or federal enforcement that we'd want to see around what the laws are, what they should be, what they're supposed to be on the book. So that's a problem we're dealing with here is a lack of guidance. But I think this is one of the things, that if we could get it out of healthcare, if it's understood as a fundamental civil rights issue rather than a healthcare issue, because healthcare is within the state law, right? The states control healthcare. So it was instead understood as this is not a healthcare law. This is like some sort of, rights-based law of some kind that had a federal jurisdiction around it, then that might be a way to kind of move it around. But, what the practical process for doing that in the United States is, I don't really know anything about that. I'm not a lawyer. So, yeah.
Thank you.
And I think Jim had hand up and then Scott.
So, I mean, I thought Carolyn's original question was about language. And the different terms, and I think they're all euphemisms. And I think we should quit using their euphemisms. The one that drives me the most nuts is people saying ECT, which happened today. I won't name names, Susan. And it's electroshock. And a lot of
call it what it is.
a lot of times, people won't really know. Like I use the term neuroleptic instead of antipsychotic, but you kind of have to explain that. But you don't have to explain electroshock. People know what electroshock is. And for, detention, I just tend to call it psychiatric incarceration or psychiatric imprisonment, because that's what it is. And actually, if you look at the definition of inmate, it's someone who's in, a hospital or locked in a or a prison or locked in a hospital. I think this issue of language is very important, and
yes, it is.
And we have succumbed to using their language, and we should use our own language, but it needs to be explained, and a lot of time, and depends on the audience.
Yeah.
So Jim, I have to defend myself here. I read off a sheet that said ECT, and then I'm pretty sure I said electroshock. And maybe you, because I agree with you. I don't call it treatment whatsoever.
So sometimes, see, I might use it, and I'll say why, since this is relevant. So I think that movement has to start within academia and nonprofits. So they have to create it, because the media is never going to create that standard, because guess what? We're all under the gun for keeping things within a certain amount of word space. And yes, anything that challenges the conventional way something is being said already requires more verbiage to explain, and so on and so forth. Like I made that compromise with my book. I think every time I said it, I said people labeled with psychiatric disorders or people labeled with mental illnesses, because I just couldn't stomach myself, and I had the book to work with, right? But you know, I can't do that in an article, right? Often, you know, like unless I'm writing for a website that has unlimited space or whatever. But if you're writing for a magazine or newspaper, you have very limited. So I just don't, I'm just saying, I don't think they're going to create the standard. And if you want to create it, you have to start that movement. And I agree, it's great. I love the terms Jim's using. And that really has to start, all the nonprofits that work in this space have to be using it like consistently all the time. Just this is the definition, you know, and using it in that almost like in a in a neutral way, saying this is just the neutral term for it. Right now, it can sound inflammatory to say that. And so then, you know, an editor will go, wait a minute, you know, what are you doing here? So we have to kind of really shift how the public sees these terms, right? And then use them. But so we
And
can.
then, oh, sorry. We got Scott has his hand up and
Yeah.
Susan for a while.
Am I on?
Yep.
You know, as I've mentioned before at other meetings, I have bizarre neurometabolic problems. My mother suffered a similar symptomatology, which took her life. And I believe it's not an unusual problem. It's common, but it gets buried under mental health because although it's physiologically unspeakably agonizing, it also affects behavior. Well, of course. And I could go on and on about it, but, you know, and I've had to fight that system for I've been fighting them since the age of 14. I refused psychiatric treatment at the age of 14. I'd had enough. And again, some of the reasons, what these people, what the so-called professionals did and said, I mean, you know, of course it wasn't legal. Of course it made no sense from the standpoint of treating a so-called mental illness. It only made sense from the standpoint of them maintaining their position, their hegemony. And one thing I've learned, because there's been a number of attempts to get me committed, the one thing I learned, you must fight back in such a way that the people who do something that's out of line and it's already in violation, the laws are there, in many cases, not in all, but the laws are there. You know, but they get away with it. Nobody does anything. But if you do something that actually brings some kind of material harm to the individual, even if it just means that they're going to have to show up in court when they think they're immune, that's never going to happen. Anything. But until you do that, unfortunately, humans are humans. There's a quote, power never yields except to demand. It's not the exact quote. I've seen several versions and several versions of where it came from. Some said Malcolm X, but what it means is that unless you do something that causes them to be responsible, to be accountable, nothing will ever change. I mean,
So I appreciate these sentiments because you're really making a call to action. And I think some of us don't know how to respond, or not how to respond, but what is the appropriate call to action. And we're already at close to the 2-hour mark. I see Susan Fitzmaurice has had her hand up for a bit, and I actually have to leave right at 6 because I have a call to action that I have to go to.
I just want to say thank you so much, Scott. You know, I totally feel for you in that situation. And yeah, I agree with you wholeheartedly on everything you've said. And yeah, I think that that's it. There needs, it is as broad as these laws are, as much latitude as psychiatrists have, medical staff have, they're still breaking the law routinely, right? And I show that in my book, and every independent investigation we have shows that it's absolutely the majority of cases. So not just like this is common, the majority of cases where we have an investigation show they're breaking their own laws, even when they do this. So we got a major problem of accountability in this whole system, and we need to start demanding accountability. And so that means we have to actually track this more. We have to publicize it more. We have to lobby around it more. We have to launch lawsuits, all these things. Absolutely.
May I add, you know, I'm in a situation right now where I'm literally losing my life. And again, why and how this is a factor, because in many places in the country, housing, affordable housing, is reserved, and as to why I'm unable to hold down a job, that's physiological symptoms too. I can work, but again, you know, this is what makes my situation, or my case, if you will, different than so many others, is that I simply resisted. I fought back. Otherwise, the whole story would get buried. But right now, I'm in a housing situation that is literally taking my life. It's ruining worse and worse. It's taking my strength. It's ruining my ability to concentrate because I could not find housing.
I know, Scott.
In
And you're not
Philadelphia, because
alone.
it's
I gotta say,
reserved. But
yeah.
you see, what more important, no, the housing was there. It was there. It was available, but only to consumers of mental health. This is a clear violation of the Americans with Disabilities Act.
Yep.
It
And you're not
also
alone,
provides-
Scott. You're part of a movement, right? I mean, not a movement that doesn't exist, but you're part of you're many people in your situation. Yeah. I feel for you totally.
But what I'm saying is that again, what has teeth, if I may use that, is to point out that not only this, first of all, it drives up the cost of the housing because tacked on to every single unit of housing is the cost of the person going to a therapist, the cost of the drugs that are almost undoubtedly going to be prescribed. And it also, for those people who feel they need counseling, they do need mental health services, it puts a strain on the system so that those services are harder to get for the people who do think they need them. Because there's so many people I've seen in Philadelphia clinics where people would come in to get rubber stamped mentally ill so they could get services that the ADA guaranteed to them. But they had to be a consumer mental health to access them.
So when that happens, it's not really housing first. And I really want to give Susan Fitzmaurice, who's really worked hard to do these rooms, who's had her hand up for a little bit now.
I wanted to bring up something that hasn't been brought up amazingly in all this conversation. And that, well, as some background, I had a niece who had attempted suicide 3 times. And she agreed with me that it was time for voluntary commitment. And so we did that, and it was productive to a degree, but I wanted to bring her home. I could not bring her home because they gave me the threat of, if you don't stay until we release you, then you're going to have to pay for all this. But if you stay until we release you, your medical insurance will cover it. So the medical insurance company has a tremendous amount to do with why people are committed and how long people stay, because it's profitable.
Yeah.
I think that goes on a lot in like drug rehabs and eating disorder addiction treatment centers. where, you know, you're not locked up, but if you leave before we say you're okay to leave, you're going to pay tens of thousands of dollars for whatever we did or didn't do. Sorry.
No, that's completely relevant. I mean, it's happening in lots of places.
And
You know,
they're force feeding.
it's voluntary, except
too.
it's not. You're coerced to stay. So at what point does the voluntary become involuntary?
Yeah, and it's absolutely routine in all these spaces that people are told something like a message of that kind. You know, if you don't sign yourself in voluntarily, then we will detain you, you know, and we'll detain you for longer if you don't sign yourself in voluntarily. So, you know, that's routine, right, in all these spaces. And yeah, and then the payment, how that ends up playing into it too, can be used against people. So yeah, there's a lot of that manipulation. And again, an amazing lack of oversight and accountability around all of that. All right, looks like we're wrapping up here.